The sun hung low over the canyon, pouring molten gold across the cracked red earth. A single rider moved through the heat haze, his horse's hooves stirring little spirals of dust that rose and vanished in the burning air. The cowboy's name was Ethan Cole, a man with a face carved by wind and time, the kind of man who had stopped counting the miles behind him. His only companion was silence, and he liked it that way. He had been riding since dawn, chasing nothing, running from everything. The desert was vast enough to swallow memories whole, or so he believed. But that day, as the horizon shimmered like a dream, a sound broke through the quiet, faint at first, carried by the wind. It wasn't the cry of an animal or the creak of a saddle. It was human. Small. Desperate. Ethan pulled on the reins, his horse snorting against the heat. He listened again. The cry came once more, thin and cracked, like it had run out of strength long ago. He turned toward it, guiding his horse down the slope, past the bones of a fallen wagon, the remains of a campfire long dead. And there, among the ash and sand, he saw her. A little girl, no more than 6, sat on the ground with her knees drawn to her chest. Her dark hair was tangled, her skin blistered from the sun. Around her neck hung a beaded string, and in her hands, she clutched a small wooden doll. Her eyes, wide and lost, looked at him like she wasn't sure if he was real. Ethan dismounted slowly, boots crunching in the sand. "Hey there, little one," he said, voice low, careful. The girl flinched. Her lips moved, whispering something he couldn't understand, a language soft and musical, full of fear. He knelt beside her, noticing the tracks around them, footprints, broken arrows, blood half buried by the wind. A raid, recent. Whoever had been with her was gone. He felt the old ache stir in his chest, the one he thought the desert had buried years ago. The girl's lips trembled. "Mama," she whispered, and the sound cut straight through him. He looked away, jaw tight. He had promised himself long ago never to care again, never to play savior. The last time he tried, it cost him everything. His wife. His little girl. A fire on the border and screams he still heard in dreams. He could ride away. He should. But when the girl tried to stand and stumbled, his body moved before his mind could argue. He caught her, felt the heat of her skin, the tremble of her breath. "Easy now," he murmured, lifting her up. She was light as a feather, bones and dust. He carried her to his horse, wrapped his old coat around her, and gave her the last of his canteen water. The girl looked at him, her eyes glassy and strange, but she didn't cry anymore. Maybe she was too tired to. Ethan climbed into the saddle, settling her in front of him. The horizon stretched out endless and cruel, but for the first time in years, he had a direction. He clicked his tongue, and the horse started forward. The girl leaned her head against his chest, whispering that one word again, softer now, "Mama." Ethan stared into the fading light. He didn't know where her mother was, or if she was even alive. But something deep inside him, something buried under the years, whispered back. "I'll find her, kid," he said quietly. "I promise." And as the desert swallowed their trail behind them, the lonely cowboy who thought his heart was dead rode toward a story that would bring it back to life. The morning after they found each other, the desert was still and empty, as if the world had paused to watch them ride. The child slept against Ethan's chest, her small hands gripping the leather strap of his coat. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and every sound she made pulled him back to memories he'd buried deep, a tiny laugh, a lullaby he once knew by heart, a promise he couldn't keep. By the time they reached a trading post near Dust Creek, the sun had begun to climb. The place wasn't much, a few crooked buildings, a saloon with half a roof, and a well that coughed up more sand than water. He tied his horse and carried the girl inside the general store. The woman behind the counter, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, froze when she saw the child in his arms. "Apache?" she asked, voice tight. Ethan didn't answer right away. "She's lost," he said finally. "Found her out past the ridge. No sign of her people." The woman frowned, glancing toward the window as if someone might overhear. "Ain't smart, cowboy. Folks around here don't take kindly to that kind." Ethan's eyes hardened. "She's a child, not a kind." The woman looked at him for a long moment, then sighed and poured water into a chipped cup. The girl sipped slowly, eyes darting between them. She still didn't speak English, but there was trust growing behind her fear, fragile as a flame in wind. He bought bread, a blanket, and a small pouch of dried berries. As he turned to leave, a man near the door, drunk, dirty, wearing a deputy's badge that had seen better days, spat tobacco juice onto the floor. "You planning to raise her like one of yours?" he sneered. "You'll get yourself shot for less around here." Ethan stopped. The air went tight. "You got something to say it straight." The man grinned. "Just saying, cowboy folks don't like trouble. That's all." Ethan's hand brushed the grip of his revolver, a quiet reminder that he wasn't a man to test. The drunk's smile faded. Without another word, Ethan pushed past him and stepped into the blinding sun. Outside, he lifted the girl back onto the horse. She looked up at him, her small face streaked with dust, and for the first time, she smiled, shy, uncertain, but real. He tried to ignore the warmth it stirred in him. "We'll find your people, little one," he said softly. "Ain't gonna leave you out here." As they rode, the road turned into open land again. The girl began humming a tune, a strange, gentle melody that rose and fell like the wind. Ethan recognized none of it, but somehow it felt familiar. Maybe because it came from a place untouched by hate. That night, they camped near the river. He cooked beans over a small fire, the flames painting her face in orange light. When he offered her food, she pointed to herself and said, "Naya." Ethan nodded. "Naya," he repeated, testing the sound. "That your name?" She smiled faintly and nodded again. He leaned back, watching the stars bloom above the canyon. "Well, Naya," he said quietly, "looks like it's you and me for now." He thought of the family he'd lost, the faces that haunted him in dreams, and wondered if this was God's cruel way of making him remember what it meant to care. As he drifted into sleep, the wind carried voices from the town they'd left behind. The traders were talking, their words chasing through the dark. Somewhere out there, they said, an Apache widow had been seen searching for her lost daughter. Ethan's eyes opened. He looked at the sleeping girl beside him, her little hand curled over her doll. The fire cracked softly. He didn't know it yet, but the trail he'd chosen would lead him not just to the girl's mother, but to the one thing he thought he'd buried forever, a heart that could still love. Days passed in a rhythm of dust and silence. Ethan rode with the girl across wide plains where the wind sang through the sage and the sky seemed endless. The child, Naya, had grown stronger, her cheeks no longer hollow from thirst. She rode steady now, sometimes pointing at distant hawks or the silver flash of a river far below. Her laughter came rarely, but when it did, it startled Ethan like thunder breaking over dry land. In the small towns they passed, people watched them with suspicion. Mothers pulled children inside, men stared from porches with hard eyes. Ethan ignored them, though his hand never strayed far from his revolver. More than once, someone muttered under their breath, words like savage, half-blood, curse. He kept walking, kept his head down, but inside him something stirred, anger, maybe, or guilt. He wasn't sure which. One evening, while trading pelts for supplies, he overheard a group of men at the saloon. Their talk was low and bitter, but one name caught his ear, Ayanna. They said she lived north, near the canyon springs, a healer among the Apache. "She's looking for a child," one man whispered. "Says the soldiers took her, or maybe settlers. Won't rest until she finds her." Ethan's heart gave a slow, heavy beat. He turned slightly, listening harder. The men laughed then, cruel and mocking. "They say she's a beauty too," one said. "Face like carved stone, eyes like storm clouds." If she weren't one of them, his voice trailed off, leaving the rest unspoken. Ethan finished his drink and walked out before his temper found a reason to speak for him. Outside, the night air was cold, clean. He looked toward the dark horizon where the canyon lay hidden beyond the hills. Maybe it was foolish to believe, but some part of him, the part that still remembered hope, told him this Ayanna might be the mother he was meant to find. He returned to camp and found Naya asleep by the fire, the doll clutched to her chest. A coyote called from far off, lonely and distant. Ethan sat beside her, staring into the flames. The firelight danced over her small face, and he thought again how fragile she looked, how innocent in a world that didn't forgive much. He pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands. The brim was frayed, the leather cracked. When he set it beside her, Naya stirred, half asleep, and reached for a small feather near the fire. She tucked it gently into the band of his hat, her eyes still closed, and whispered something he couldn't understand. Then she drifted back into sleep. Ethan looked at the feather, red at the tip, black near the quill, and felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was nothing more than a child's gesture, or maybe it was a sign. The desert had its own ways of speaking, quiet and strange. He lay back and stared at the stars, thousands of them, cold and bright. The thought of Ayanna stayed with him, a woman searching the land for her lost child. Somewhere out there, under that same sky, she might be looking toward him, praying he existed. The fire sank to embers. The wind moved through the grass like a whisper, and in that whisper he thought he heard a promise, that the road ahead, though rough and long, would lead him to something worth all the miles behind. The path north took them through a land that seemed older than time itself. The canyon walls rose like ancient guardians, painted in layers of red and gold, and the river below cut its silver thread through stone and silence. Ethan and Naya followed it for 2 days, camping under the open sky. He'd begun to feel a strange calm in her presence, as if her small voice and quiet laughter had softened the rough edges inside him. By the third afternoon, they reached a narrow trail where the wind carried the faint scent of smoke and sage. Ethan slowed his horse. Ahead, nestled between two cliffs, stood a cluster of huts made of clay and branches, their roofs shimmering faintly in the sun. Smoke curled upward from a central fire, and figures moved slowly through the haze. The sound of distant singing drifted through the air, low, rhythmic, like a prayer carried on wind. Naya stirred in front of him, her head lifting. Her eyes widened as she recognized the song. She whispered something in Apache, voice trembling, and before Ethan could stop her, she slipped from the saddle and ran toward the sound. He called after her but didn't chase. He watched her small figure dart through the sagebrush until she reached the open space between the huts. Then, from the shadows, a woman turned. Her hair fell long and black over her shoulders, braided with red beads that caught the light. She was singing by the riverbank, her hands rinsing herbs in a clay bowl. When she saw the child, her body went still. The bowl dropped from her hands, breaking against the stones. Naya stopped a few steps away. The two stared at each other, the air heavy and trembling, as though the world itself had stopped to listen. Then the woman, Ayana, fell to her knees and let out a cry that echoed across the canyon. Naya ran into her arms, and they clung together, weeping softly, the river's song folding around them. Ethan sat still on his horse, not daring to move. He'd seen many things in his life, death, greed, fire, but never anything as pure as that moment. When Ayana finally lifted her head, her eyes found his. They were deep and dark, filled with a strength that made him forget the distance between them. She stood slowly, holding Naya's hand. The child pointed toward him and spoke a few words, her voice full of excitement. Ayana looked at the man on the horse, his worn hat, the dust on his coat, the quiet sorrow in his face. She took a cautious step forward. "You found her," she said in halting English, her voice soft but steady. Ethan dismounted, removing his hat. "Just happened to be in the right place," he replied. "Couldn't leave her there." Ayana's gaze lingered on him, unreadable. "Many would have." He nodded, unsure what to say. "Guess I ain't many." She studied him for a moment longer, then gestured toward the huts. "Come. You need food. Rest." He hesitated but followed, leading his horse. As they entered the small settlement, several men and women appeared from doorways, their expressions wary. Ayana spoke to them in her language, her tone calm, firm. The tension eased, though not completely. Ethan felt every pair of eyes on him, measuring, doubting, questioning. She led him to a shaded spot near the river. "Sit," she said. "I will bring water." When she returned, they sat in silence, the only sound the murmur of the stream. Naya played beside them, humming her tune again. Ayana finally spoke. "You carry pain, cowboy." Ethan's eyes met hers. "Guess pain rides with every man who's lived too long." Something passed between them then, not words, not understanding, but a quiet recognition. Two people who had lost too much, finding in each other a reflection they didn't expect. The sun began to sink, painting the canyon in amber light. Somewhere behind them, a drum began to beat, slow and steady. Ayana turned toward the sound, then looked back at him. "You can stay here tonight," she said. "But tomorrow, you must decide which road you'll ride next." Ethan glanced at Naya, who was laughing softly now, her small hands tracing patterns in the dust. He knew the woman was right. But for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he wanted to keep riding. That night, as the stars rose over the canyon, he lay awake near the fire, listening to Ayana's voice drifting from the shadows, a song about loss, about love, about spirits who find each other again after the long road ends. And though he didn't know the words, something in him understood every note. The days slipped into a rhythm that felt both strange and familiar. Ethan stayed longer than he planned, helping where he could, repairing fences, cutting wood, fetching water from the spring that wound through the canyon like a silver vein. The people watched him at first with suspicion, but slowly, the hard stares turned to cautious nods. Children began to follow him when he worked, laughing at his awkward attempts to mimic their language. Naya was always among them, her laughter bright and free now that she was home. Ayana moved through the village like sunlight through leaves, quiet, constant, always doing something for others. She gathered herbs, treated wounds, spoke to the elders in soft tones that carried more weight than volume. At dusk, she sang by the fire, and even the wind seemed to listen. Ethan found himself watching her more than he should have, noticing the way the light played against her skin, how her smile came slowly, like a secret. One afternoon, he sat sharpening his knife by the river when she came to wash clothes. She didn't look at him at first, but her voice reached across the water. "You stay longer than most strangers." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I got nowhere better to be." "Maybe," she said, wringing out a cloth. "Or maybe you're afraid to leave." Her words caught him off guard. He met her gaze and saw something there, not accusation, but understanding. "I've spent half my life running," he said quietly. "Maybe I just got tired of it." The breeze shifted. Naya came running down the path, holding a small bird in her hands. Its wing was bent, trembling. Ayanna knelt, speaking softly to the child, showing her how to hold it gently, how to set the wing straight with a splint of reed and string. Ethan watched, something tight in his chest loosening with each careful touch she gave. When the bird was bandaged, Ayanna looked up at him. You see? Even small things can heal if they are not alone. He nodded, words lost in the weight of the moment. That night, as the fire crackled, Ayanna brought him a bowl of stew. They sat side by side, Naya asleep nearby. She told him about her husband, a warrior who died protecting their home from soldiers who came looking for gold and land. Ethan listened, his jaw set, his own ghost stirring. When she finished, she looked at him expectantly, as though waiting for him to share something too. He hesitated, then said, I had a wife once. And a little girl. Lost both when the border caught fire. I thought if I kept riding, maybe I'd ride far enough not to remember. Ayanna's hand moved slightly, resting near his. You cannot outrun memory, she said. You can only make new ones strong enough to stand beside it. The air between them grew still. Somewhere beyond the firelight, an owl called. Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing like a promise neither dared voice. But the peace didn't last. The next morning, a scout from the edge of the canyon rode in with dust on his face and panic in his voice. He spoke quickly to the elders, and though Ethan didn't understand the words, the tone told him enough, trouble was coming. Ayanna turned to him, her calm cracked by fear. Soldiers, she said. They come again. Ethan rose slowly, pulling his hat low. How many? Too many, she answered. They say we stole horses. We did not. But they do not care. He looked toward the ridge where the sun burned white through the clouds. He'd seen raids like this before, how quickly reason turned to fire. He checked the cylinder of his revolver, each click echoing through the silence. You and Naya stay back, he said. I'll talk to them. She stepped closer, eyes fierce. If you stand with us, you stand against your own people. He met her gaze, steady and sure. Ain't got people, he said. Not anymore. She stared at him, then nodded once. The decision hung between them, heavy and final. As the drums began to sound in the distance and dust rose on the horizon, Ethan felt the weight of what was coming. The desert had taken everything from him once. But this time, he would not let it take them. Dawn broke sharp and cold, the kind of light that felt more like steel than sun. The canyon, so peaceful the day before, now seemed to hold its breath. Ayanna moved swiftly through the camp, her voice calm but urgent as she gathered the children and the elders toward the shelter caves. Naya clung to her skirt, frightened but silent, her doll pressed against her chest. Ethan saddled his horse, checking his rifle and the worn revolver that had followed him through too many bad years. From the ridge above, dust clouds swirled where the soldiers approached, maybe 30 of them, their shapes dark against the morning glare. Ethan knew their look even from a distance, rifles slung low, faces set in that hard expression of men convinced of their own righteousness. He'd ridden with men like that once. It was what made him sick now to see them coming. He turned to Ayanna, who was tying bundles of herbs in a satchel. When they reach the valley, there won't be time to talk, he said. Get to cover. She straightened, eyes flashing with quiet defiance. If I run, my people will think there is no hope. I must stand with them. You're no use to them dead. And you, she asked softly. You would die for people who are not yours? He tightened the strap on his saddle, then looked at her. Maybe they are now. She didn't answer, but something in her gaze shifted, sorrow, maybe, or gratitude that had nowhere to go. Then the sound of gunfire cracked across the canyon, and the choice was made for them. The first shots tore through the morning like thunder. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the smell of gunpowder rolled down with the wind. Ethan swung into the saddle and rode hard toward the ridge, positioning himself between the soldiers and the camp. Bullets hissed past him, biting into stone. He fired back only to scatter them, not to kill, though part of him knew mercy might be foolish today. The soldiers shouted for him to move aside, to turn over the renegades. He shouted back that there were women and children down there, that no one had stolen anything. But the commander, a young man with polished boots and dead eyes, only laughed. You don't decide what's true out here, old man. We do. When the soldiers advanced again, Ethan drew his rifle and fired a warning shot into the dirt before their horses. The animals reared, scattering dust. Turn back, he shouted. You burn this place, you'll burn what's left of me. For a moment, the soldiers hesitated. Then one fired. The bullet ripped past Ethan's arm, grazing the flesh. He grunted but stayed upright, pulling his horse back as chaos exploded. Smoke and screams filled the canyon. Down below, Ayanna and a few men rushed to move the wounded. Flames licked at the edges of one hut as sparks jumped from a fallen torch. Ethan rode back down, dismounting to drag a child from the fire. He turned just in time to see Ayanna kneel beside a fallen soldier, pressing her hands to his wound. The man groaned, terrified. She looked up at Ethan, blood on her palms. "He is still human," she said breathlessly. "We do not leave him." He wanted to tell her to run, that compassion would only get her killed, but her face stopped him. In her eyes, even in the middle of smoke and ruin, was the same calm that had drawn him from the first moment. She was mercy in a place that had forgotten the word. Another volley of shots rang out. Ethan spun and saw Naya standing near the edge of the clearing, frozen as a burning hut collapsed beside her. He ran, scooping her into his arms just as debris rained down. A searing pain tore through his side, and for a heartbeat, the world went white. He stumbled but didn't fall, clutching the girl close until they reached the river's edge where Ayanna waited. She caught him as his knees buckled. "Ethan." Her voice broke, the name raw and unfamiliar on her tongue. He felt her hands pressing against his wound, her breath warm against his face. "Keep her safe," he managed to whisper. "Don't let them take her." Her eyes filled, but she nodded, tightening her hold. Around them, the gunfire began to fade. The soldiers, seeing the dead and the wounded among their own, finally pulled back. Dust and silence followed their retreat, broken only by the crackle of what still burned. When it was over, Ayanna sat in the ashes beside him, Naya curled against her side, her small hand clutching his sleeve. The river murmured nearby, washing red dust away in slow ripples. Ethan's breathing was shallow, but his eyes stayed open long enough to see the smoke lift from the village, curling into the blue sky. "Looks like, you were right," he murmured, voice fading. "Even small things can heal." Ayanna leaned close, her tears falling onto his face like rain. "Rest now, cowboy," she whispered. "The land will remember your kindness." And as the wind rose through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and smoke, the man who once wandered without a reason finally found one worth dying for. The sun rose quietly the next morning, thin and pale through the smoke that still lingered above the canyon. The ground was littered with spent shells and broken arrows, and the air smelled of ash and dust. The worst of the fire had burned itself out during the night, leaving only smoldering huts and blackened earth where laughter used to live. Ethan lay on a mat inside one of the surviving shelters. His side was bandaged with clean strips of cloth, the wound deep but not mortal. He woke slowly, his breath shallow, his throat dry. The first thing he saw was Naya sitting beside him, eyes red from crying, clutching her wooden doll close. She gave a small, trembling smile when he looked at her, as if afraid he might vanish again if she blinked. Ayanna appeared a moment later, her hair loose, her face drawn from exhaustion but calm. She carried a bowl of water and a bundle of herbs. "You should not be awake yet," she said softly. Ethan tried to sit, grimaced, and gave up halfway. "Seems like I've done enough sleeping for one lifetime." She knelt beside him and dipped a cloth into the bowl, pressing it gently to his forehead. Her hands were steady, her touch cool. "The soldiers are gone," she said. "They took their wounded with them. They will not return soon." He exhaled slowly, relief flickering in his eyes. "How many did we lose?" "Too many," she answered. "But the children are safe. The old ones too." Her voice trembled only once, then steadied. For a while neither spoke. The only sound was the soft rush of the river outside and the crackle of a small fire. Naya leaned against his arm and whispered something in her own tongue, a blessing, perhaps, or a simple thank you. Ethan didn't need to understand the words to feel their meaning. When Ayanna finally spoke again, her tone was quiet but firm. "You cannot stay here, Ethan. The army will look for you. They will say you turned on your own." He looked at her, a tired smile crossing his face. "Ain't sure I've had my own in a long time." "Still," she said, her eyes softening, "you need to heal somewhere safe. Far from this place." He tried to argue, but the truth was in her voice. He nodded slowly. "Maybe I'll head east, find a quiet stretch of land. Put my horse to pasture, rest a while." She said nothing for a long time, only watched him as she wrung out the cloth again and laid it over his chest. The firelight made her skin glow, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. "When I found Naya," he said finally, "I thought I was just doing what was right. Never figured it'd lead me here." Ayanna's lips curved faintly. "Sometimes the right path is not straight. Sometimes it circles back to what your heart has forgotten." He turned his head toward her, his voice low. "And what about you? You'll be all right?" She nodded. "My people are strong. We will rebuild. The earth forgives faster than men." She hesitated, then added, "But the earth does not forget kindness." Outside, a soft breeze swept through the canyon, carrying away the smell of smoke. Naya had fallen asleep again, her small hand still gripping his coat. Ethan looked at her, then at Ayanna, and something inside him shifted, a quiet peace, gentle and unfamiliar. When the sun began to climb higher, he struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on the doorpost. Ayana moved toward him, ready to steady his arm, but he shook his head. "I can manage," he said with a half-smile. "I've ridden out of worse." She walked him to the edge of the village where his horse waited, saddled and restless. The land stretched before them, wild, endless, full of roads leading nowhere and everywhere. "You'll come back," Naya said suddenly, clutching the hem of his coat. He knelt, brushing her hair from her face. "You keep listenin' to your mama," he said softly. "And when you see the clouds touch the mountain tops, think of me ridin' somewhere out there." Ayana stepped closer, her eyes bright in the morning light. "The land will carry your name," she said. Ethan nodded. "And my heart'll carry yours." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the wind moving gently between them. Then he swung into the saddle, the leather creaking beneath his weight. He looked back once, saw Ayana with Naya beside her, their figures framed by the rising sun. He touched the brim of his hat in a silent farewell and turned his horse toward the open plains. The trail ahead was long, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel lost. Behind him, the river whispered against the stones, and the sound of it followed him like a promise, soft, steady, and alive. Weeks passed, the kind of weeks that blur together when a man rides alone. The desert changed its face every day, red cliffs fading into yellow plains, cactus blooms rising from dry sand, storms rolling in and breaking apart like restless ghosts. Ethan rode through it all, his body healing, his mind quiet. The pain in his side dulled, but the ache inside him, the one that had lived there for years, began to ease in ways he didn't understand. He built a small cabin near the mouth of a canyon where the river bent and the air smelled of pine. It wasn't much, 4 walls, a roof of timber and thatch, but it was enough. He spent his days gathering wood, fishing, patching old saddles. When the nights turned cold, he lit a fire and listened to the coyotes sing. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the south, he swore he could still hear Ayana's voice in it, soft and distant like a memory that refused to fade. One morning, the sound of hooves broke the stillness. He stepped outside, hand instinctively brushing his gun belt, but what he saw made his heart stop. 2 figures rode toward him, a woman and a girl. The woman's hair was braided with red beads that caught the light, and the child beside her sat straight in the saddle, proud and smiling. He stood frozen as they approached. Naya jumped down first, running to him, her laughter echoing through the valley. She wrapped her arms around his waist, and before he could even speak, Ayana was there too, dismounting with quiet grace. "You built a home," she said softly, her eyes sweeping over the small cabin, the corral, the smoke curling from the chimney. "Tried to," Ethan said, voice rough. "Didn't expect company." Ayana smiled, the kind of smile that carried both strength and peace. "The tribe moves north when the seasons change. I chose a different direction." He looked at her for a long moment, unable to speak. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say, about how often he'd thought of her, how every sunrise felt empty without the sound of her voice. But words felt too small. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. Her fingers tightened around his, warm and sure. "The land is wide," she said. "There is room for our hearts to meet." They spent the rest of the day repairing the corral and unpacking what little they'd brought. Naya chased the river's edge, collecting smooth stones, while Ayana worked beside him, moving as if she'd always belonged there. When the sun dipped behind the canyon, the 3 of them sat outside the cabin, watching the sky bleed into shades of orange and violet. Ethan turned to her. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he said quietly. Ayana looked at him, her eyes catching the firelight. "You found me once," she said. "The earth only returned the kindness." He reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down. There was only the sound of the river, the warmth of her beside him, and the laughter of the child who had tied their fates together. When darkness fell, rain began to whisper across the roof, soft at first, then steady. Ayana leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting over his heart. "The rain has come," she murmured. "It brings life again." Ethan smiled, closing his eyes. "Never thought I'd see the desert bloom." Outside, the earth drank the rain greedily. Inside, by the glow of the small fire, they sat together in silence, a silence not of loneliness but of peace. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole wasn't a wanderer anymore. He was home, not because of walls or land, but because of the 2 souls beside him. When morning came, the world smelled of wet sage and clean air. The sun rose slow and golden over the canyon, and Ayana stood at the doorway, Naya in her arms. Ethan watched them, a quiet smile on his face, knowing that whatever roads lay ahead, they would ride them together. In the distance, the river kept on singing, carrying the story of a cowboy who found his heart again in the wild places of the world, and of the woman who taught him that even the hardest land could bloom with love. Years slipped away like quiet wind over stone. The small cabin by the river became a home filled with laughter, smoke from the hearth, and the steady rhythm of a life rebuilt from dust. Naya grew tall and strong, her hair long like her mother's and her eyes bright with the same wild light that once guided Ethan through the desert. She learned to ride, to track the stars, to mend fences and heal wounds, carrying a piece of both worlds inside her, the grace of her mother's people and the quiet strength of the man who raised her. Ethan grew slower with the years, his hair turning silver beneath his hat, but his spirit stayed steady. Every morning, he walked to the river and sat by the smooth rocks where the water curled and whispered. Ayanna would find him there sometimes, staring at the horizon, the sun painting his face in gold. She would sit beside him without speaking, her hand resting in his, and together they watched the seasons turn. There was no need for words between them anymore. Everything that mattered had already been said. When Ethan's final winter came, it was gentle, like a long sigh after a weary journey. The snow fell light over the canyon, wrapping the world in quiet. Ayanna stayed close, tending the fire, humming the same lullaby she once sang to Naya as a child. He listened to it with a faint smile, his breath slow, his eyes filled with peace. One morning, before dawn, he reached for her hand and whispered her name. She leaned close, and he said softly, "You were the road I was meant to find." His fingers went still, and the wind outside carried the last of his breath into the pale sky. They buried him on a hill overlooking the river, where the land spread wide and endless beneath the sun. Ayanna placed a small feather in the earth beside his grave, the same red-tipped feather Naya had once given him. Then she stood in silence, her tears falling quietly, and whispered a prayer in her language, a promise that his spirit would never ride alone. Years later, when Ayanna too became one with the land, Naya returned to that hill. The cabin still stood, weathered but strong, its door open to the wind. She knelt between their graves, placing wildflowers she had gathered from the valley, yellow, white, and red like the colors of dawn. The river below sang the same song it always had, soft and steady, carrying the story of a cowboy and an Apache woman who had defied the desert and found love in the most unlikely place. Naya closed her eyes and listened, her lips moving in a whisper that trembled between sorrow and gratitude. "They said love cannot bloom in the desert," she murmured. "But you showed the world that even the driest land remembers rain." The wind rose gently, brushing her hair, and for a moment she could almost hear her father's voice carried in it, low and warm, the voice of a man who had once promised a lost little girl that he would find her mother, and found instead the meaning of his own heart. Naya looked toward the horizon, where the sun met the canyon's edge. The light touched the earth in gold, and she smiled. Then she mounted her horse and rode along the riverbank, the water gleaming beside her like memory itself. Behind her, the land stood quiet and eternal, holding the story of two souls who found each other in a world that tried to keep them apart, a love that outlasted dust, silence, and time. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these tales of courage and love alive.